All right, doesn't look like we quite have a quorum yet, but maybe give it a couple minutes and we'll see who's trickling in, and I'll keep track as we go for a moment.
Hey, you think we should wait a minute or two, or
Yeah, um,
well, I think I'm going to get started. I see
okay, yeah, we're getting close.
17 people. So welcome everybody to what day is it? September 23rd, 2025 meeting of the single exit multiplex housing tag. Let's go ahead and take a roll call
All righty, Roger Haringa,
in here.
Dan Young,
Here.
John Hall, not seen in the room. Joe Mayo, not seen in the room. Andy Lorenz, not seen in the room. David Kinley,
Here.
thank you. Jeremy Moore,
Here.
thank you. Jonathan Goldsmith, not seen in the room. Robert Baglio, not seen in the room. Michael Wright.
Here.
And Michael, are you the right iPhone 15?
I am.
Okay, thank you. Jesse Bank, not seen in the room. Shweta Sinha, not seen in the room. Mike Messer,
Here.
thank you. David Lynham, not seen in the room. Our primary fire spot has resigned the position, so Dave Cocott, I won't be calling the names beyond this point. Rich Geiske,
Here.
Spencer Gardner,
I'm here.
thank you. Derek Weigel,
Yep. Here.
thank you. Richard Williams,
Here.
thanks. And John Sue,
Here.
thank you. With that, we have a quorum.
All right, is there anybody from the public that would like to be recognized? Go ahead, Patrick.
Yes, Patrick Hanks with the Building Industry Association of Washington. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Can get my participants? Okay. Ardell, do you want to be recognized?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand on this app. My name's Ardell Jalla. I'm the building official for Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Darren?
Yes, just recognize if I want to make a comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. Okay, I don't see any other hands. So with that, I just wanted to, as far as the introduction, I just wanted to remind everybody of our current schedule. Discussing multiplex housing every other meeting, so basically once a month, alternating with the single exit. So the dates for the multiplex are today, October 21st, and then December 2nd. With the hope that we will be done by December 2nd. So as always, that's somewhat in flux. Don't need to, I don't want to have any other additional meetings if we don't have to, but if it meant one additional meeting, we would. So anyway, schedule is always being discussed, but those are our current, the three meetings are what we have left currently scheduled for the multiplex housing. So, and ultimately, I would like to suggest that we've decided as a goal anyway, between today and the October 21st meeting, we will pretty much have agreement on most of the main issues. And then whomever, I don't remember who did the who authored the baseline document, but then we can go back and modify the baseline document per our discussions. And then the final meeting would be a walkthrough of the final baseline document. At least that's the plan. So anyway, with that, agenda item number 2, review and approve agenda. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I so move.
Thanks, Derek.
Second.
Second was Richard Williams. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? I don't think that was any opposed. I think I just talked too quickly, so. Agenda is approved. The minutes, we have the minutes from the September 9th meeting. If you could slowly scroll through those so that we recognize them on the recording. And when we're through, I will ask for a motion to approve.
That's the end of the minutes.
Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved. John, see you.
Thanks, John. Second?
Second, Spencer Gardner.
Thanks, Spencer. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, minutes are approved. Agenda item number 4, which is multiplex housing work. So this is where we get into it. And again, I want to thank Dan for filling in for me at the last multiplex housing meeting. I'm going to let Dustin go through and present this in detail since I'm a little bit behind where the progress we made last time. So.
Gotcha. So the last time we were here discussing the multiplex housing stuff, we left off pretty much after the egress configuration topic, appendix location AX 103.1.1. Let me get down there to it. And so coming out of that one, Angela, John, and Rich were going to work on some interior exits language. I don't have any new documents from them to share with anybody, but I would like to, I guess, ask if there's any ideas coming from discussions in between the meetings that we could deliberate here today.
Yeah, Dustin, just to let you know, we have not had a chance to meet to work on this.
Okay, no problem. So that means we should probably move beyond most of the egress configuration topics that we have here, unless anybody has something that they would like to add to maybe the considerations for John, Angela, and Rich. Any ideas that folks been having that we might want to advertise to that group before we move to parking requirements would be next.
Could I just ask, because the egress actually is a pretty, there are a number of items. Could somebody summarize for me the challenge or the conflict? I mean, reading, I guess it's the open-ended corridor. Those are the challenging questions.
Roger, I think the issue is that it sounds like there's a fair amount of support behind allowing interior corridors, and how do you configure those interior stairs and things like that. Right now, I believe based on the current wording of the proposal, it's all exterior, so it's all exposed to weather.
Right. Okay,
So the question is, how do you protect them?
yeah. Okay. Well, then let's go ahead and discuss parking requirements.
Okay, give me one moment to update some notes here. All right, so getting on to parking requirements, that's located in the proposal document AX 104. And that's what we have going on here. And we have a note on here that this shouldn't be included in the appendix because it's a zoning requirement. And so I'd like to hear what the group has to think on including this in the appendix. And if we do the content of what we have here in section 104.
This is the first time I thought about it, Dustin, is Derek Hugel. And first inclination is 100% leave it to the local land use code and not have it in the appendix. That's my thought.
John?
Yeah, I mean, these are topics that are covered by the building code. It's not saying that how many you have to put in there. It said if you provide it, you got to do the electrical vehicle, the EV charging, and you got to have accessible parking spaces. That's a requirement in the building code already. I believe the EV charging is, I know it's controversial, but I believe that's still, in the building code right now, at least the state code. So I think those are appropriate topics for, to say how are you going to handle them.
Jeremy?
I was going to say, ironically, I agree with both of the last two people. That of course, parking is with your local land use, but this is more of a pointer, and it's just pointing to the IBC basically and correlating that. Hey, when parking's provided, which will be dictated by your local land use, but when it's provided, we're going to take care of EV and accessibility in accordance with these two things. And I just think, could you delete it? Yes, but this might help with continuity throughout the whole state with these pointers to it. I think it works.
I'm doing some digging. Spencer, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I have a question. So in a sense, we're taking aspects of, through this whole exercise, is taking aspects of IBC and bringing it into appendix of the IRC, if I'm understanding everything correctly. So the IBC includes requirements for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and for accessible parking spaces, correct? I think that's correct. But the IRC, I think, does not. So to me, the question is, do we want to adopt the IRC approach to both of these questions? Or do we want to adopt the IBC approach to both of these questions? And I don't, at this point, have a strong opinion about it. I'm trying to understand the root issue here. We're blending the IRC and the IBC codes together to some extent. So we're choosing which parts of the IBC we want to apply. Am I thinking of that correctly?
I agree, and that's kind of what I've been trying to ponder as well. And in fact, sorry, phone's ringing. A question that I have is both, I was looking at the EV charging, requirements in the RCW for EV charging. And probably the bigger one is accessible parking spaces. Is there, does anybody know, in IBC or how does an IRC handle accessible parking spaces now?
They don't.
Okay. And for the IBC, what is the requirement for parking spaces, for accessible parking spaces? That's going to get into ADA stuff, right?
ADA is typically, I believe it's chapter 11, and 1106 would be, I think, the specific section. And that's the 2021. I don't know for sure if that's in alignment with the 2024 code. And it's really, if you have the parking in place, then it's shall comply.
Marcus, you have,
Yeah,
comment?
this was the one I was just, in particular, I was going to bring up a potential conflict between the IRC and the IBC, just in the sense of right now, so if you go to the International Building Code for 104.1.2 for accessible parking spaces, it's just basically any 1 to 25 is what it says, has minimum number of one accessible space. But then in the IRC, we also have the you wouldn't have to have accessible units until you get the 4 units within a building type of thing. So if you build a multiplex that is 3 units, you're then being asked to do an accessible parking space, even though you don't have any accessible units or a requirement to do any accessible units. If we move forward with the way that it's written here, is so in a document that I had sent, I had done like an exception for to accept basically multiplexes of 3 units from this thing if you're going to keep this language. But that was the conflict that I was seeing, is that you're requiring an accessible parking space for potentially a multiplex that doesn't even have any accessible units.
So you would suggest that at the end of it, however it's written, you would suggest, Marcus, that the accessible parking spaces are only required if you have 4 or more, because you would have an accessible unit.
Right. Or accessible, requiring or having an accessible, at least one accessible parking space should only happen if you have accessible units within the building type of thing, which happens generally at 4 or more units.
Okay. Darren?
So R320 does mention accessibility in Chapter 11, and then you have to follow the R3 guidelines in the IBC. But in the IBC Chapter 11, there's 2% for the site, and then there's 1 for accessible units. So the 2% for the site doesn't go away just because there's no accessible unit. Chapter 11 still requires at least 1 accessible parking stall for 2%, I believe, in the IBC. So it indirectly, R320 takes you to Chapter 11, and then the 2% requirement for at least 1 parking stall if you provide a parking stall.
David?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to reiterate, 1106 talks about all the units that are on a site. So if there's multiple of these buildings on a site, it would still bring into effect the requirements for accessible units, or I'm sorry, for accessible parking.
Okay. Richard?
Yeah, to what Darren was saying, in section 1106.3, keep in mind that those parking requirements kick in if you have accessible type A or type B units. So the type B units would kick in if you've got 4 or more, dwelling units. So it's contingent on the fact that there are type B units there. And Marcus, is that in line with what you were saying?
Yeah, that was the concern I was having, but I'm now seeing that language in 1106.3. So you're saying basically that the language is already here that kind of protects around if there's no accessible units, then you're not required to do an accessible parking space.
I think it's consistent. Yeah, I think that's picked up in that manner. And currently it's R320 that sets that, 4 or more than 4, whatever it is.
Right.
And we are proposing it, we'll get to that in a minute. We're proposing to kind of change it slightly, but I think that is how this gets picked up correctly and makes it consistent.
David, your hand is still up. Do you have more comments?
Starting all over.
Okay. Jeremy, your hand was also up.
Yeah, thank you. I think to clarify, originally there was a pointer that just said accessibility will be in accordance with R320 because it's in the IRC. And then all those pointers that Marcus and Richard has been talking about, of course, go on, so on and so forth. I think the difference is with this proposal here is the accessibility says that it's going to be in accordance with the IBC for R occupancies, and accessibility is going to be for group R2. So the real difference is just the blanket IRC is going to say deal with it as an R3. And this proposal says, you know, we're going to do it in accordance with R2 because it does look and act like an apartment. Do we really want to reduce accessibility in apartment style living in that manner? Because if you just went with the IRC, it points to the building code but says deal with it as an R3. And I think that's really the difference between just pointing to R320 versus using this verbiage.
Hey, Richard.
Yep, Jeremy, that's what I was alluding to in terms of the difference that we'll be talking about in this accessibility chapter, because we're picking up on the, you know, we're proposing to change the designation from R3 to R2, so that we don't lose anything with the, you know, we're currently thinking of these as apartments under the IBC. So in order for to stay consistent, that was one of the important things that we put here was to reference R2 occupancies instead. And by doing so, and again, I'm jumping a little bit out of parking, but in doing so, you also keep the requirement for type A units in the event that you'd have more than one of these buildings on a site that would result in, you know, more than 10 units. Our state amendment kicks in and requires a type A unit. The threshold's 10 instead of 20 for the base code.
So, having minimal knowledge of those, being a structural engineer, as we have the XX 104 and XX 105, are there proposals to modify? I kind of heard that the on-site parking people kind of came around to understanding that the section 104 might be okay as it is. The 105, should that be R2 or R3? I guess I'm asking for suggestions.
All right.
Richard?
Yeah, I do. I think it should be R2 as shown here in
Okay.
105.1.
So you're okay with it as it is?
Correct. As it's shown here, yes.
Okay. I see a hands up from David. Derek?
Maybe it's ignorance, but I am thinking that if you're trying to lean this more towards the IRC to leave it as or comply with R3 versus the R2, but where there are 4 or more dwelling units in a single structure, the provisions of Chapter 11 and IBC shall apply. Multiplex should be considered an R2 for accessibility. Yeah, I don't know. I just do a lot of affordable housing stuff, and they will modify them and do they'll go way overboard on accessibility, which is fine, and we do it. But then you turn around and try doing some market rate stuff and parking stalls and all that stuff. The accessibility gets kind of challenging, but maybe I'm not making a lot of sense.
No comments are All comments are welcome. Let me put it that way. Richard?
Yeah, Derek, I think it's the two pieces to that. You know, number one, what I was talking about before with, you could have a multi-unit building that's constructed as an apartment building under the IBC. And that would be subjected to R2, it's an R2 occupancy, so it'd be subject to the requirements of R2 for accessibility. So by changing it here, we're staying consistent with that so that we're, you know, not running into this situation where you build a similar building out of two different places and have come up with some different results in terms of accessibility. And then the other part is just reiterating what I said before about possibly losing a required type A unit. And again, that would only be if you had multiple buildings, which I think that's up for discussion. But if you have multiple buildings on a site and ended up with more than 10 units on a site, then a type A would kick in. So I think it's important for those two reasons to keep this R2 occupancy designation.
Gotcha.
Richard, just to be clear, if you do the conversation about 10 units, you could still do two of these 6 unit on a site as long as they're separated properly, correct?
Yeah,
And
well,
then
I believe that's what we discussed, Roger. I believe that's correct. Yeah. So what I'm saying is like, in terms of the number of units, you consider all the units on a site. So if there were 2 6-unit buildings on a site, it's 12 units. So anything more than 10 for the site would require 1 type A unit
Yeah, okay, all right. That's what I
in
thought.
either one of those buildings.
Yeah. Darren, go ahead.
I was just going to mention the table in IBC 429.2. It talks about Group R occupancies, buildings that do not contain more than 2 dwellings. It's not required for EV parking spaces, but it's one each unit for EV ready. But all other R occupancies, it says 10% of total parking spaces capable EV parking, and then EV ready is 25%. And then as it brings out, the accessible parking is 10% of that. So I guess that's based on the B units, which are 4. So there's a lot of complications in here, but you can still get there with the IBC, whether it's in the appendix or not. It's the EV charge capable and EV ready are still going to be required in Group R occupancies, whether it's and all other Group R occupancies, if you look in that table in 429.2. So I don't know if that muddies the water or not, but it's going to be required either way.
I may have some additional mud for that water.
Yeah.
We have a proposal on the EV charging sections for the 2024 code, adjusting some of those values.
And better defining what EV ready and EV capable are. So
Yes.
Spencer, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little confused by that. I mean, we're working on an appendix to the IRC, which means that a table that's in the IBC would not apply unless we specifically point to it. Is that correct? And I guess my comment is again, we're blending IRC, IBC, kind of blending some lines here, but I think accessibility seems like a pretty significant item that we want to make sure is considered and included in these kinds of proposals. On electric vehicle charging, I'm more inclined to lean towards the IRC, which I don't think requires anything. So, again, if we're looking at the requirements of IBC versus IRC, I think I'd prefer to see the electric vehicle requirement just removed completely, or point to the IRC that deals with electric vehicles.
This is the current state amendment for IRC for EV charging.
So there would have to be a circuit.
Attached garage or carport. and then they would have requirements.
If there's a garage or carport. If not. And this is whether there are 3 units or 4 or 6, correct?
This is if there's one unit,
Right.
and you put a garage on it, you need that circuit.
Okay. I think it's Rich, right? Gaiski?
Yeah, quick question on this. This is talking about attached private garages or attached private carports. Does this whole conversation about parking stalls change if we have like a common parking area, like under the building? We're talking 6 units in a IRC built structure now, and if we have 6 units that are common to one parking area, all open to each other, does that change any the conversation?
I have a lot of experience with that actually, with our small cottages that we build in the factory. We're not required to put EV charging outlets on them because there are no garages. Think of just a tiny home, small modular structure. There's no garage. And we do common shared parking, and we have yet to be called out to have EV ready or EV charging stations.
Yeah, I can,
Current code.
having been very involved in the IBC proposal update for the EV charging. I don't see where I have a tendency to agree with Spencer. If we relied on the IRC. However, what I get a little bit concerned about is if there are a large site with, for whatever reasons, that you are providing, let's say there's a larger site and you have 6 of these 6 plexes and on-site parking. So now you have 36 units. I would suggest that some of those should be EV charging. And what I've seen, it seems like we're in a little bit in between in that the IRC may not require it, but if you start stacking multiple, and even if we don't connect them, which is one of the topics up above, but even if you don't connect them, you can have a site that has several of these buildings on it, assuming they're separated appropriately, and you have on-site parking. Those should fall under the IBC parking criteria, in my opinion. John, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to respond to what I think I heard from Rich Geiske, who was the concern about would there be a common parking garage? And no, there would not. I mean, under the current scope, it's limited. These are limited to residential with no common use areas, and the parking garage underneath the building would be considered common use. And that's how as currently worded anyway. And I know common use, there's a desire for some flexibility on the common use, but I don't think the intent is to start putting garages and common garages under these.
Okay, Ardell?
Just one point of information. The direction to the Building Code Council to adopt EV into the building code was originally coming from separate legislation, RCW 1927-540. And so my concern would be in changing the scoping of the parking requirements by saying, no, this is now an R3. And I apologize if I've missed the discussion, but has the decision been made that these multiplex buildings are R3? Is that correct?
That was talked about, but I don't
Okay.
been decided. And in fact, I felt like we were moving away from that. So
I just wanted to point out that it may conflict with the earlier legislation of 1927-540 to change the requirements for an apartment building and EV parking associated with an apartment building of 6 units or less to match R3. So if there's some way to either go back to that legislative intent and see if it's within the scope of this tag to reduce it. If that's even really in the purview of this tag.
Okay. Dustin has that up. Except for rule related to R3. Where does it say then for the R3?
So item 2 says to provide this parking, EV charging capability at all new buildings that provide on-site parking. So it starts with that and then goes down to the exception for R3s. And that's how the language is drafted in the SBCC, sorry, in the building code. So while I'm not an expert on this original RCW, I guess I'm just cautious on changing or reducing the requirement for EV parking and the associated accessible EV parking to less than what was required by the original EV legislation. So I would be a
Okay.
proponent for the language as currently proposed.
I think that the challenge is, Ardell, how do you read what's proposed? It's if required, if provided. On-site parking shall comply with. And I
So
think,
I think it can be scoped so it's aligning with accessibility. So it wouldn't apply to 3 or less dwelling units. But when you have 4 or more dwelling units, well, sorry, that's fair. So what is the scoping? And right now it's kicking to R2 for the table.
that's for accessible, but that's why I'm struggling getting the EV and the accessible. It seems like they're different requirements. And what would be, given the way it is currently written, what would be required if you had 3 units? And what would be required if you had 6? And you provided on-site parking. I think if you had 3 units and you had 3 parking stalls, you wouldn't have to do an accessible parking space. But I think that you would have to provide an EV charging space. Is that how you read that?
I would read it as kicking to, so just going on the count of the stalls. Are we talking about the RCW or the way the code is written?
The way the code is written.
The way the code is written, I would go to 429.
Yeah,
And then I would say for where parking is provided, I would look to the table in 429 and say that for that 6 unit, sorry, I got to get to that section again.
you'd have 10% at least of EV ready or EV charging.
Correct.
So you would have 1 EV charging space, but you would also have it if you had 3 units. A multiplex with 3 units, you would also have to have an EV charging. Because you have to round up. So what we're in effect, and I'm not trying to steal the conversation here, but what I think that we are doing is if you have 3 units, the way it is written right now, you're gonna have, and 3 units with 3 parking stalls. You're going to have an EV charging, but you would not have to have an accessible. If you jump to more than 4, you're going to have an accessible. And you're gonna have 1 EV charging. I think that that's how it's written right now. Darren, go ahead.
So I think it boils down to if it's an R2 or R3, it changes the scope of the accessible parking requirements, because it goes back to what Rich was saying, 11063, the groups. Is it R2, R3? Is it A, B, type A accessible or type B, or is it R3? In 429, 2, that's under all other group R occupancies, 10%, 25%, or is it group R, where it's not required, EV capable, or one for each dwelling unit? So it depends on which occupancy is decided, R2 or R3. It changes the percentages, it changes the numbers. So it has to be nailed down which occupancy it's for first.
Okay. Spencer, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate Ardell pointing to that. RCW, I was not aware of that language. I do think we're in a situation where we're getting competing mandates from the legislature because the RCW that convenes this technical advisory group finds that lowering the cost of middle and multiplex housing will increase the housing supply. And then it talks about home builders and residentially focused architects being more familiar with the requirements of the IRC. So in this case, it seems to me like to me, it seems like we have a choice. Do we, did the legislature intend for us to follow their, the RCW around charging stations, or with the convening of this technical advisory group and the concerns about costs and familiarity, do we have the latitude to determine that the vehicle charging is not required as a way to meet that mandate? I think my own personal feeling is that we do have some room to reduce those vehicle charging requirements. But in any case, it is certainly confusing.
And I will point out, Spencer, item 2 of the RCW for the multiplex housing says that we must consider the life safety systems and accessibility requirements for multiplex housing from the Washington State Building Code. So accessibility and life safety, I don't think that we can. EV charging, I guess that's open for discussion. But Richard, go ahead.
This is in response to Darren, section 1106.3, item 1 applies to R2, R3, and R4 occupancies. So it would apply to both R2 and R3. And then if you go to table 429.2, that just is a blanket reference to R occupancies. So I think in either case, those requirements would kick in and apply.
All right, Patrick, what say ye?
Yes, I was very involved in the EV charging stuff on both the IBC and the IRC this cycle. I think this is a perfect little case that shows the problems with the IBC requirements, because like, let's take, if you have a threeplex, and if they have a shared parking area or a common parking area, parking lot, and if they have 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, so they have 6 parking spaces. Under the new requirements for the 2024 code, they're effectively going to have 100% of parking spaces have some kind of EV charging infrastructure, which is disproportionate compared to other apartment buildings that'll have to have lower percentages. So you'd have to have 1 space that's a dedicated charger, 1 space that is ready for a charger to get installed, and then 4 spaces would have to have the EV capable, so conduit installed to them. If they have private garages, then it would be more akin to the IRC requirements, where they just have to have basically a plug ready for a charger to be put in. But yeah, I think the smaller the less amount of dwelling units to have and the higher ratio of parking is when these EV charging requirements get very disproportionate, which I think this is going to be that kind of use case scenario where you have a small number of dwelling units, 3 to 6 dwelling units. You're probably going to have 1.5 to 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. You're going to hit very close to 100% of parking spaces having EV charging infrastructure. I think the law does allow some different rooms, and like we have different requirements for the IRC than the IBC. So I don't think under the law you have to have the exact same requirements, across all residential buildings. Because we found that, single family is fine to have different requirements. So if the tag wants to consider, maybe lessening some of the IBC requirements, I think there's some room you could consider that, but it is a complicated discussion, and there's new stuff that will complicate it even more. So thank you.
John, go ahead.
Given what Patrick just said, I think we should not mess with this and let the SBCC figure out what they're going to do first before we try to mess with it. I think the pointer to whichever one works, or excuse me, whichever one section we want to point to is just leave it at that and not try to mess with it, because otherwise we're going to derail this whole thing with EV discussions.
So I see a whole bunch of thumbs up dancing across my screen. So the suggestion, John, just to be clear, you're saying the way it is written right now with 104.1 and 105.1, leave them as they are.
Well, they're independent a little bit, right? Yeah, as I think you pointed out, accessibility is not the same thing as EV.
Right.
So EV, that's a huge discussion that's happening elsewhere.
Right.
And I think we just need to let that finish and get decided before we even think about doing anything with that. As far as accessibility goes, I think there are, we've had some suggestions here to maybe scope it so that to make sure we don't overdo it. But they so make sure things don't kick in until 4 units, but which would then comply with fair housing and things like that. So but calling it an R2 I think is appropriate myself. So yeah.
And I think my confusion too is that when I hear accessibility, I think of accessible parking spaces, and that's up in 104, whereas accessibility is 105. So that's just where I get a little mixed up. But and I think right now 105 does say if there are 4 or more dwelling units. So at 3 units, you don't need accessible units.
Right. Yeah. So you could rescope 104.12 to match.
Where there are 4 or more dwelling units.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That would clarify it for me. Jeremy's got a thumbs up. Or move 104. I don't know. Is it better code language to move accessible parking down to 105 or to just add that clarification? The 104.1.2.
And you could move the accessible parking spaces into accessibility. That would work. Then do you need, then what do you do with 104.1 or that's kind of orphans the EV thing? You retitle that as EV or something like that. I don't know. There's other changes you'd have to make, but I think it works either way.
Okay. Spencer, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, I understand not wanting to get too cute with the EV charging requirements, given that there's a lot of discussion happening. Would it not be just as simple to point to, instead of to the IBC, to point to the IRC? And I guess that goes back to my argument that if our direction is to try to reduce costs and make sure that we're using familiar provisions for residential home builders, that for EV charging infrastructure, we could just point to the IRC instead, and that conversation will still play out. But in the meantime, we're using the less restrictive version.
Okay. And I don't disagree with you, Spencer. I kind of lean that way myself, but can I get Dustin, so that we could get the accessible parking spaces, I think, off the table and understood, can we add where there are 4 more dwelling units in a single structure added to the front part of that accessible parking? That makes some sense to me, and I'm open for other comments, but I think that solves the accessible part for us, correct? So, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to respond to what Spencer says. You know, I wouldn't key too much on the familiarity part. I mean, with the code, that's the whole point of putting this in the appendix. So that they will get familiar, builders will get familiar with it, and it'll be there for them to use. So, you know, I don't think that's necessarily something that would say, well, we should lean this way or that way. We there may be other reasons for leaning one way or the other, and maybe it's to be close. We want to be close to R3 on this one, but the familiarity piece is again why we're developing this whole thing.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, Roger, I'm fine with adding this highlighted language in 104.1.2. It's a bit redundant, but I don't think it hurts anything. I mean, I say redundant because the only time that accessible parking requirements would kick in is if you have 4 or more dwelling units, and that's because that's the point at which type B units are required. So, but again, it doesn't hurt anything. So if it helps people, if it helps reinforce what's required, then I'd probably be okay with it.
Okay, Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I mean, ask another version of what Spencer was asking, I guess, in terms of back to the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. If the decision based off of maybe how disproportionate electrical infrastructure might go in for smaller apartment buildings in the multiplex, and if the decision is, or if there's a kind of notion that we shouldn't touch it until they figure out what's happening with electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, does it make sense then to still have the language here that's pointing to the international code versus the IRC code, or and then slash if you don't want to, if it's not ready to be touched, should we not even have this like line in here in terms of electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, and you just do what's based off of what's in the IRC, essentially.
So my understanding, and I think my response, Marcus, would be right now, if there are 3 units, you just need to have a plug-in and if you have a garage, you have to have, or a carport, you have to have a plug-in, and there's nothing more, right? And if we are expanding this to 6 units rather than 3, do we say the same thing? And if I would have a tendency, I mean, there's a balancing point, right? Between there is a push for us to have EV charging for sure. I mean, it's still a state law that by 2035, you can't sell gas powered cars anymore. So EV charging is coming. My concern gets into where you have a site with, like I said, 5 or 6 of these buildings, and you're starting to get 30 or 36 of these dwelling units on a site, and you have no EV charging. And I don't think that is correct either. So outside of what it says in the code, you know, I would be fine, however we write it, going with the IRC requirements as long as it's maxed out at 6. But if you have multiple buildings on a site, I think you should go to the IBC requirements. That's what, I mean, given I hear both Spencer's point. I agree. The driving language of the RCW is to make it more affordable. And I also understand that the EV charging is expensive. So those are kind of in conflict. And
so sorry. Somebody else has their hand. I was just gonna finish and just say, okay, so it sounds like it still makes sense for some type of language here in that section. Okay.
I think so, and I have just been itching to call on Micah for him to straighten us out.
think I'd straighten you out, because, you know, everybody has their opinion on the EVs, but I don't believe that going with the IRC allowance would meet the intent of the legislation. If you remember, Roger, I believe you advocated for putting it in the IRC just based on the simple fact that they removed R3 occupancies from the legislation in 2021. And the intent, of course, they went back to the legislators for the intent, and their intent, yes, at some point was to get 1 and 2 family dwellings to provide some type of EV. But I think we'd be doing a disservice to that piece of legislation to say, well, this legislation says a lower cost, but we're not going to meet the requirements of the other legislation and have special rules around the EV for multiplex housing. And I'm sure that is not the intent. I know the intent is to lower the construction cost, but to not meet RCW 27540, I don't think that's the direction that was indicated to provide options for multiplex housings to come out of IRC, and that would be just to eliminate any other advances that were put in the IBC. And again, I'm not advocating necessarily for the language in the IBC. If you all remember, I voted against that just based on the simple fact that building officials are not electrical enforcement officials. That's handled through labor and industries, unless you are one of the 34 or 35 jurisdictions that have their own electrical programs. And even then, that code official would have to be a licensed Journey electrical installer. So I just think you ought to stick with this language. It points you to the appropriate section so far of the building code, which is 429, and that may be further modified in the 2024 code, but right now that is the correct section, providing your EV infrastructure for multifamily housing, actually any housing outside of R3, which in my opinion is not correct either, because R3 is included in the building code, so it would apply the same. However, residential occupancies are specific in the table. Once we get into this, I would not conflate this being something other than an R2. It's just you're going to be allowed to construct that R2, which is more than 2 dwelling units, out of the IRC with some special caveats. But when we start, I think everybody's talking about that mixing and matching, all these different regulations, it's going to be even more confusing when I think the whole task for this is to provide simplification. Thanks for letting me chime in.
Thank you, Micah. So I feel like I want to take the accessibility language and suggest that we are all in relative agreement that what we've got is correct or okay. I might flag the electrical vehicle, the EV charging as something that we continue to ponder. I think we don't need to make a final decision. Like I said, I go back and forth both ways. So I think if we can separate that, Dustin, and I think the general agreement is to leave the language in 104.1.1 as we have it, but flag it as yellow so that we come back and revisit and people can ponder it a little bit longer. That sound acceptable to everybody? Okay. Moving on, elevators. Elevator size, elevator standards, elevator, what does that say, voluntary?
Yes, in space.
Voluntary something in space. No, I don't think we are doing anything out in outer space, so. All right. Marcus, your hand is up. I don't know if that's still or from the past.
Yeah, just put it up.
Okay.
This is another situation where there's both language in the IRC and the IBC, and if right now, if you send it to the IBC, my concern is the IBC requires basically any R2 building or R1, R2, or I occupancy buildings to have the elevator accommodated ambulance stretcher sized elevator, which is the largest elevators type of thing, no matter what size or how many floors there are. So this could be a 2 or 3 story building, and instead of you being able to just go to section R321 in the IRC and just do elevators that are in compliance with ASME A17.1, which could be a smaller elevator that complies with that. You're kicking anybody that wants to do an elevator to do the biggest elevator, which means basically nobody will ever put elevators in these buildings. Or elevators will only be for buildings that have really wealthy, rich people that can handle that extra cost. But the large elevators are really expensive, and for a project this size, there's just not enough units to kind of spread that cost around.
I am looking at R323. Is that the right?
321 will be elevators and platform lifts
Yeah.
for the 2021 code.
Yeah. Oh, is that I'm in the wrong? Is it 323 in the 24 IBC?
Yes.
IRC? Okay, that's where I'm. All right, other comments? Darren.
I just have a question for Micah. If Seattle has buildings like this, how does the Seattle Fire Department deal with what kind of elevators are they using if they have buildings like this in Seattle?
Micah, are you still on?
I am, but if Ardell is still on, that would be a better person to ask, as Ardell is our building official. Thanks.
Thanks, Micah. We do provide stretcher-sized elevators in buildings of this size as required by the IBC today. The one comment I don't know, and maybe you know this, Marcus, with the change in the accessibility standard clearances, or maybe Rich, you know this, is the interior dimensional requirements of a ICC compliant commercial elevator or residential elevator that's not for a private dwelling. What is that dimensionally related relative to the stretcher sized elevator? I don't know that offhand.
Yeah, I saw that comment in an email. I'm not sure either. I thought it was just out of chapter 30 IVC, but I'll check and see if there's anything in A117 that talks about actual dimensions for the stretcher itself.
No, not Rich, not like if you took away the stretcher, if you took away the stretcher and just used the new standard for A117, what is the minimum sized elevator?
Oh yeah, I'll find that for you. There are some dimensional requirements. Yeah.
And then I don't know who asked, but I apologize, I didn't catch your name, but yes, the Seattle code currently requires the stretcher elevator as per the code the state code language. So it's only when it's provided.
And I had this question through the IBC as well, and somewhere along the lines, this same question came up. When is the elevator provided? Is it ever provided in in this scenario, 3 stories, 6 units? Would it ever be required?
It's the developer's choice.
Okay. So it is never required, at least anticipated in the way we are doing this in the multiplex housing, but if they so choose, they've got to go with a larger, and currently it is no interior corridor, so it would be, those elevators would be outside or at least the vestibule or something, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And Roger, be required in a couple instances. One would be if you required an accessible means of egress elevator, which would kick in 4 more levels stories above a level of exit discharge, or if you had common spaces that were accessible, you'd have to have an accessible route to those spaces.
So we don't have that, Rich, right? Is my understanding for the multiplex.
That's correct, Ardell. Yeah, that would not apply to this project.
Currently, I think those are some questions up above, and somebody mentioned keeping it simple. As a group, we need to make this as expansive and usable as possible. We need to keep it simple and simple.
Roger, keep in mind that, it's not required, but if it's provided,
Yeah.
then type B units would be provided on all floors, and then, the accessible route would be your elevator. And then the dimensional requirements for an elevator kick in. That makes sense.
I think so, sorry. John, go ahead.
Yeah, and this actually the size of the elevator cab came up in, I think it was the single exit, one of the single exit discussions as well. And I recall, and I don't remember who said it, but there was someone who said that the only difference between a structure size elevator, and the current A117 elevator is the location of the door, that you couldn't have a center door for a structure size. I don't know if that's true or not. That's not something I've looked at, but that might, for Rich's purpose, if you're going to look into that, that was said in one of the meetings earlier.
Okay. So looking at the topics in the section, I think that it is row 36. Elevators are voluntary, and it sounds to me like people are agreeing we shouldn't require elevators. So there's agreement on that they are not required, they're voluntary. Then there is I guess those other 2 rows, 34 and 35, are similar, right? Whether they are just normal elevators per 117, or whether they need to be the structure. And the City of Seattle is structure. Correct? Somebody correct me if I'm misstating what it's.
That's correct, and that's a state requirement. We comply with the state law on that.
Okay. So would we not be able to, we would still have to meet the state requirement, right, Ardell?
It is a state requirement currently in the IBC.
Yeah.
So it would be within the purview of this committee to revise that by pulling these small apartment buildings into the IRC. I guess there's one point of caution in doing that is, I don't know if we have any of our fire colleagues on the call. This is for them. And also, is that a change then that should also be considered for a 3-story building in the building code?
Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, the question, I guess, to me comes down to whether there is a difference in kind of the dimensional size between, a regular A17.1 elevator or a stretcher elevator. If there's no difference in size, and I guess this language works fine because it's going to be the same either way. If there is a difference, or if there are elevator options that are smaller than a stretcher elevator, then I think you want to consider just pointing to that language rather than pointing to Chapter 30 in the building code that basically says if you do an elevator, you have to do the largest elevator type of thing. So it comes down to whether there's a dimensional difference between elevators that are usually used. If there's not, then this seems okay.
Marcus, I get your point, but it really is cost. I mean, if you have one more foot on an elevator, that's not the big upcharge. Is the cost of the elevator itself to go to the stretcher size. So, I'm paraphrasing, or I think that's the point you're getting to. Darren.
So for our occupancies in 1009.2 continuity of components, they have to have one means of egress. So one of them could be elevator. They could do other ways to do it, but elevator. But under 1009.21, the exception is a 13 sprinkler system. Then you don't have to do an elevator. So if the building's sprinkled, the 4 or more stories requirement is accepted by a sprinkler system, so it's not required. 1009.21. Thanks.
Oh. Right. I think the sprinkler is still a discussion item up above. I don't know that we concluded that, or did we conclude that it's a 13R? We did. All right, Richard.
Yeah, I don't think that's quite accurate. I don't think it is exempted from sprinklers, but I could check that. But I was gonna speak to the elevator sizes. There are multiple allowed sizes for elevators in A117. It's in section, for anyone who is interested, 407.4. It gives dimensions based upon the basically the size, dimensions, and the shape of the elevator, the interior of the elevator. I'm not sure about, and there's no reference to the like we were talking about before. There's no reference to the stretcher itself in A117, as people pointed out. I don't see any reference in scanning over it. I don't see any reference to the location of the door when it comes to the stretcher. But it could be I'm just glossing over it, but I'll leave it there.
Okay. And I remember what John said is at one of our other meetings, I think it must have been the single exit, that comment was made, but I don't remember by who either. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so Rich, I got 2 questions. Well, first of all, it's not that the A117 said anything about the stretcher size. It's just that someone said, in order to accommodate the stretcher and get it in there and things like that, you had to put the door in a certain place, but that the overall size of the cab remained the same. So the question is, my question is, since I'm not looking at A117, is that required? Is a wheelchair elevator, accessible elevator, required to accommodate the full, whatever it is, 5.5 foot turning circle, as opposed to it used to be the 5 foot turning circle, right? Or whatever, whenever that went out last cycle or whatever. But now they did expand that that turning circle. So did that kick over to the cab size in A117 is kind of my question.
Yeah, John, the answer is no. Interestingly enough, that there's multiple dimensions here. I'm looking at a stretcher, centered door, 80 inches wide, 51 inches deep. Another one, 68 wide, 54 deep with an offset door. So yeah, that it is kind of counterintuitive, right? There's no turning circle required in there, or provided anyway. Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing I have to look a little further into the offset. See, the way I look at it, the only way you'd get a big stretcher in there is if you had that 80-inch by 51-inch elevator. Maybe it has to be bigger. But that configuration is shown in the A117 with a centered door. So anyway, I will leave it there too.
All right, Mike, would you clarify us the requirements from a fire perspective?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can clarify, but I definitely give a little bit of perspective. So, bottom line, I think what we're going on is a situation that I just went through, horizontal exiting and areas of refuge in a much larger building. But when it comes to elevator requirements, required elevators, typically your 4 stories or greater to where the elevator is required to be an accessible means of egress. And there's just so much more that plays into it. I think on the fire side, if an elevator goes in, we'd obviously definitely prefer to have a rescue elevator, which is a larger elevator that y'all are talking about, because we will use that for helping patients egress. And typically, you've got patients that are immobile or bedbound, and for whatever reason, they will choose the top floor to go live on, and it definitely becomes a bit of an issue for us. But I think the group's already mentioned on it. Elevators for a 3-story building typically aren't required as an accessible means of egress, period. We just stop it right there. But as we move forward into the multiplex, if one's put in, I know at least for fire, we definitely prefer it to be accessible for our use for helping those patients egress in a medical emergency. Anything less, unfortunately, the elevator just isn't even useful for us because we can't get the stretcher in and out, even in a collapse situation. And our stretchers will collapse down to where we can sit them up. But you think like a cardiac arrest event where you have a patient that their heart's not beating, we have to breathe for them, we have to do CPR. And the advanced measures that we're putting in place, we actually need that space and we're not able to use that elevator. So then they end up going on like a Stokes basket or a backboard, or it becomes much more difficult to get them down. So just more than anything, food for thought versus the clarification of where those requirements lie.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That helps. Richard?
And Mike, yeah, just to further clarify that, for everyone who's maybe a little bit unclear, given the standard building configuration, and by standard, I mean where level of exit discharge is on the lowest level, you would not be required to have an accessible means of egress level or elevator until you get to a 5-story building, because that language talks about it being required in where stories are 4 or more levels above the level of exit discharge. So that would be a 5-story building.
Okay. Marcus, go ahead.
And Richard, just to follow up, so you said that there's a full list of kind of approved A17 elevators. Does that list, that's kind of a list that goes from small to large essentially, and includes elevators that are maybe that don't necessarily meet accessible elevator standards or don't meet stretcher size elevators, but are still certified to be put into a building otherwise?
That's correct, Marcus. There's a table in A117, table 407.4.1, and there are 5 illustrations, 5 figures that are basically just clarify that table. And I'm not sure how they're ordered. Could be from, yeah, I'm not sure about that, but the figures do a good job of showing you the interior dimensions, the locations of the door, the size of the door, things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, no problem.
So it sounds to me like, and I'm trying to wrap this up a little bit, although now I'm back to reading the exact language that it's confusing me. It sounds to me like there's a fair amount of support to just have this where provided that they have to be larger, I think. And what that will mean is, I think from a cost perspective, it will drive people to not provide elevators for these 3-story buildings. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but if it's gonna a little bit of cost or a larger cost, will there be some situations where people will decide to not put them in because they have to put the larger elevator in. However, I also think that is related to the egress questions that we're going to have up above, and whether you have interior corridors or not. So I don't want us to, I at least want us to have a yellow tag on this, because it may be influenced by the egress discussions we have next meeting. But as I read this, just the language of 106.1. Where provided elevators and platform lifts shall be constructed in accordance with R323. Except in multiplex buildings. Well, aren't we all, these are all multiplex buildings, right? That's confusing to me, just that language. Do we even need the 106.1.1 in there, or does it work to just have 106.1 and then the exception about individual dwelling units? But it's, I think, that's what we're trying to, the code language we're trying to get to, I believe, wouldn't even need to have that chapter 30 IBC requirement. And Marcus is shaking his head. I don't know that anybody else has comments, but Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, that was just going to be my kind of last thing, especially based off of what Richard just said in terms of that there are other elevators that are of smaller dimension sizes that are approved by A17. So my suggestion would just be where provided elevators and platforms shall be constructed in accordance with section R23, and you just delete the rest of everything else that's there.
Except for, I think that you need the exceptions. If you have an
Oh yeah,
elevator,
and the exception, keep the, yeah.
that exception needs to be included. And maybe you could make that part of the whole sentence. I'm not sure. That's just a grammar piece. But I think we should, I think the answer that you have, Dustin, over there on the right, that Seattle has the stretcher size for the IBC requirement. And the fact that it's voluntary down on Road 36. It sounds like that's where we've landed, but I think we need to have it yellow and we revisit this when we get into address. Richard, you have Richard Williams.
Yeah, and again, I'm looking at the IBC commentary, so take this with, I'm just scanning, take it with a grain of salt here, but this may be where Jonathan was getting some of the requirements for the offset door or the center door. If you look in that commentary there, it talks about the minimum width and depth required for interior dimensions for elevators to accommodate a stretcher. They are different than the minimum size requirements in A117, so there are some additional requirements. It looks like you can have a center door, but the dimensions would have to be larger. So that, again, I'm not sure where the commentary is getting that from, but just wanted to point out that that's in there.
Ardell, go ahead.
I think that the comments should also reflect that this is a conscious decision by this committee to recommend that the multiplex building does not have a stretcher requirement, will not have a stretcher requirement as currently put forward. Like, it really doesn't have anything to do with Seattle on this because we're just following the state code currently.
Oh. You're saying in the comment, you don't want it to be.
Yeah, the comment is that by striking this language, the committee is recommending to not have a stretcher requirement for an elevator or for use by the fire service for an elevator in a multiplex building, that the elevator will still need to comply with accessibility. And that is a cost decision and recommendation by this committee.
Okay. I actually felt like we had arrived at the fact that the stretcher elevator would still be required if it were installed.
If we don't reference the building code and we reference the residential code, that requirement does not go along with that.
Okay. Well,
I agree with Ardell. I think it's perfect. Just make a note in there and send it.
okay.
I'm neutral on the recommendation. I'm not a voting member on this committee. I just want to be transparent that that is the action being taken.
I just want to be clear, when I took the language, when I suggested we cross out the language of 106.1.1, I was just saying that, if we're having a special section for multiplex buildings, this whole appendix is for multiplex buildings, so let's have section 106.1 say what we need it to say. We don't need the separate, elevator down below, so if we think that we should have, structures, then the sentence should be, there you go. And maybe,
Well, I'm just putting this in here as an option.
okay,
Yeah, I'm thinking that because this section is about the multiplex buildings,
yes,
R23, or I'm sorry, R323 talks about elevators in single units. And this is talking about a common service elevator. And so you don't get to shaftways and hoistways and all that kind of stuff on a common service elevator unless you go to the building code. So I think we're provided in multiplex buildings, elevators and platform lifts shall be constructed in accordance with chapter 30, period. Because if you're in a 1 or 2 family dwelling, you're not going to be in this appendix, you'll be in the base code.
okay. And I think that that's what I'm getting at as well, but just the proper code language, so.
Yeah, and if you go to chapter 30, that will tell you
Okay.
at so many stories above grade or anything else when you need to provide the stretcher size elevator.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I think I was just gonna make a connection of why you would want to have the structure size elevators, because once you do have elevators, then your accessibility requirements kick in on those upper stories. So your type A and type B units, that if you did not have an elevator, you would not have to have those units, but once you do have that elevator, you do need accessibility. And then that gets to Mike's point about if you have people in wheelchairs on upper levels, then you want to get them out.
Okay. Jeremy Moore?
Yeah, thank you. I think the reason why the original language was in this, from looking at R323 is that R323, or sorry, R321 in the 21 code 323 now. It's not just for elevators. It's also to allow lulas and platform lifts and things of that nature in private residences. Is what also is included in that. So if you had a multi-level private residence, you could still go to R323 and get those in residence accessibility features. And I think that's why it was originally worded that way. And then it says, but then if you're going to do the full elevator in a multiplex, you're going to go to the IBC. I'm just kind of making an observation. I think that's why it was worded that way. It appeared to be a little ambiguous and a little confusing, and I know we're trying to clean that up, but I believe that's why it was that way originally.
Well, and I certainly wouldn't want to exclude the fact that you can use the private lifts and that kind of thing. So, Marcus, do you have a?
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, looking back at that section that Jeremy just referenced, and I guess I'm reading it as elevators, and it says or private residence elevator. So it's both saying, passenger elevators within a building, and we're saying that the multiplex is now in the IRC. So the IRC stuff does, matter with the multiplex thing. It's not just the stuff in the appendix, but so regular elevator, passenger elevator for building, and private or private residence elevator. So it's saying and in both type of situation is why I think the current language already reads, if you wanted to point to 321 or 323 as it currently is in the 2024 code. If I'm understanding how I read it is saying it and both type of situation. It's not just saying private residence elevators, it's saying passenger and private residence elevators.
Okay, so do we need the reference to R323 left in? Kind of think so, but I'm not a code writing specialist either.
I would also say that the issue that I have, or the thing that I want to highlight, or the thing that I think is still a discussion, I guess, is I do think these buildings can be do not have to require a stretcher elevator. So, and based off of what Richard said earlier, there are accessible elevators that are not the size of stretcher elevators. And those accessible elevators that are smaller than stretcher elevators should be allowed in a multiplex building of only 3 to 6 units, rather than forcing a larger elevator into those buildings, because essentially you will likely not get those elevators into those buildings, and those buildings will never have elevators. Whereas if you lower the threshold, you will have more multiplex buildings, a higher percentage chance of having elevators, which is better for residents, yeah, livability type of thing, right? So people that are in wheelchairs don't have to just be on the first floor as a rental option or as an ownership option. People with strollers, young families with strollers, can live on the top floor and also be able to get down pretty easily and all that different type of stuff. So that's the reason why I think it's an important consideration, and not to require these buildings to also have stretcher elevators.
John, go ahead.
I'll admit to be having mixed feelings about this. Kind of on the fence because, you know, I understand, you know, yeah, it'd be nice to get elevators in more buildings, but if I'm on that upper story and I've got a heart attack, I really want those fire guys to be able to do CPR on me. So that's one thing. But Roger, you kind of, I wasn't quite sure what you were saying about including R23, R323. I think we have to choose one or the other. It's either you comply with chapter 30 of the IBC, or you do R323. R323 would argue toward Marcus's argument that you would allow the smaller elevators. Point in chapter 30 would say we want to have a stretcher size elevator. And I think that's the key that we need to decide is, are we going to require the stretcher size or not? That'll then decide which section you point to. Like I say, I'm on the fence on it, so I haven't quite made up my mind on it. But you can't have both in there, otherwise you'll have a conflict.
So what I want to get to is I don't think we're going to decide today. I think people want to continue to ponder this a little bit further. I would like the markups. Dustin, maybe don't cross out section R323, and we know we need to pick either the blue or the green. And then make sure that the comments on the right, because we won't revisit this for a month, and I know I won't remember. Just to be clear that, on the comments on the right, we need to decide one or the other, whether the structure elevator is required. And then I think if people can do, I was looking back I thought I got an email at some point on one of these meetings about the elevator requirements. I couldn't find it quickly, but let's all do a little bit more investigating and make sure we understand a little bit what's required. So between the stretcher elevator and the accessible elevator, is there a huge difference? And I'm like I said to Marcus, if it's an extra 1 foot or 8 inches or something on an elevator, it isn't as big a deal for me as is there a big cost buying a stretcher elevator versus just a hand clad accessible elevator. So Ardell?
I don't want to belabor this. I apologize. I just want to re-emphasize that by referencing chapter 30, you're not only getting the stretcher, but you're getting all the other L&I coordinated changes around a common use elevator that are in chapter 30. And so by only referencing R323, I'm not a subject matter expert on conveyance, and I can tap our team, but what you're only referencing A17 or that's the ASME standard reference. That's not the accessibility reference. That's the ASME reference in 323. So I think there's a comparison that's needed between the ASME reference alone and whether that is sufficient, or is there anything out of chapter 30 besides the, not just the stretcher, but out of any safety provisions that have been coordinated by L&I as Washington State amendments to Chapter 30, that we would lose by only referencing 323. And I don't know who's responsible for doing that comparison, Roger, but I think that that is information that's important in making this decision on whether to only reference 323.
Well, I'm looking for volunteers. I mean, I agree, we need to go through that, comparison. For the meeting in a month, and it will become part of the egress. You know, again, we do need to kind of, it will come up again as part of the egress conversation, I believe.
Roger, this is Jeremy. I'm not trying to volunteer something for Jonathan, but I believe he was quite the content expert for this section of this appendix. I think he had a lot of experience dealing with the two different types of elevators and how L&I was involved and how actually the technicians that are certified to work on one are disqualified by that qualification to even work on the IBC one. So he might be a good one to tap into because I think he's pretty knowledgeable about the background on this.
Okay.
Hey, Roger, as I'm looking at the codes on this, I hate to say it, but I think as it was originally written, it was probably pretty darn accurate. If you're gonna provide a lift inside your unit, it's 323.1 or 321.1. And if you're gonna do a common service elevator, then it's chapter 30. I think that may be what I was trying to do, as someone said earlier, and it sounds pretty good, because then the exception to the multiplex building section kicks you back to 321. So I think as it was originally written, was probably actually pretty smart.
Okay. Well, let's Dustin, excuse me, Dustin, can we, can you put an email together to Jonathan? It's Jonathan Goldsmith, right? That's who people are.
Correct.
Can you put an email to section? Kind of show him where we arrived at with, and then, you know, copy the original and have him explain it to us, and then we can, you know, hopefully rely on his expertise to figure it out. So maybe what we can do is we'll try to look, Dustin and I will connect with Jonathan and try to get clarity on it, and then we will come back at the next meeting. Both for what's required and then also just getting the code language to reflect what is required, so. It is 2:38. I'm gonna suggest we take a break till 2:45. And then we will come back and talk about habitable attics. Okay. Sorry, Dustin, are you back on board?
Sure I am. Yes, sir, I am.
I don't know if the recording has started.
No, I actually didn't pause it, so we were just running the whole time.
Okay. So let's get to habitable attics. And I guess I'm just going to ask, is there anybody who disagrees with the requirement that there are no habitable attics, that they are not permitted in these? It kind of makes sense to me. You're giving another whole floor to the two-story residential construction.
Fire standpoint, habitable attics are just scary. Because you never expect to find people sleeping in an attic.
Yeah. It's where I kind of lean towards, we're already stretching things that it doesn't make sense to add that or allow that. I'm going to, certainly we can always revisit if somebody comes back and has a big challenge to it, but I'm going to suggest we say per the proposal that they're not allowed. So the next one is the structural limits. And being the structural engineer on board, I don't have a whole lot of recommendations. Got too many things open on my screen. John, go ahead.
Yeah, the question is about whether you can use the prescriptive, braced wall panels and things like that for these buildings. I know that's a topic at National this year. We'll be talking about that in October. And I know the seismic folks are concerned about that. They don't they're content. What they say, I should say, yeah, what they say is that when they did their modeling and things like that, the kind of the prototypes for the brace wall panels, they did not include multi-unit buildings. They were thinking purely about townhouses and single family. And so their concern is that the brace wall panels are, well, they don't know if they'll work, in an earthquake. So I know what they're proposing to do at National, because there is a similar proposal to, allow 3 and 4 dwelling units under the IRC. To what they're going to propose is to require basically engineered construction go to chapter 16 of the IBC and start there. Just the background for some of this discussion. That's and kind of why I threw that on the list originally was, okay, do we want to allow brace wall panels for these?
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, my concern, I think what I'm going to, hopefully support what John is saying. I am concerned that 3-story multiplex units are not designed to the IRC, do not give the same seismic performance as those buildings designed to the International Building Code. And I would ask the City of Seattle folks, I believe right now in the Seattle version of the residential code, anything over 3 stories requires the lateral system to be designed by a professional engineer, not necessarily a structural engineer, but needs to follow the requirements of Chapter 16 of the IBC. Ardell, is that correct? I don't know if she's still here.
Yeah, sorry, Mike. The Seattle Seattle residential code matches the state residential code. So if we're I guess is the question around.
There's some language
Yes.
in the, I'm sorry what chapter it is in the IRC, the Seattle version of the IRC, that says anything over 3 stories has to follow the IBC for the lateral system. And
We're not over 3 stories though, Mike. That's where I'm getting confused by the question.
I thought it was 3 stories and we're not in the multiplex.
No.
We're not over 3 stories. We are at 3 stories as the cap.
Okay. I believe maybe I'm reading it wrong, Ardell. I thought maybe I tried to just bring the language up and the site is down.
I'm
So
pulling it up. Yeah, I'll pull it up and double check, but I think I'll verify it, but this is the Seattle code uses the state requirements.
Okay.
But Ardell, what? I'm with John, just prescriptively allowing seismic design for a 2-story and now pushing it up to 3-story. I think that you can't say that you are providing the same level of seismic safety. And then my other question is, and I was kind of digging in a little bit, is stud size. At 3 stories, you've got a higher load. I can't imagine there's very often that we would be exceeding on a bearing wall. At 3 stories, you probably would be fine, although I haven't done that calculation. And so there's kind of the vertical loading prescriptively. Are you comfortable with the vertical loading on walls or columns would be okay now that you've added a 3rd floor to the prescriptive requirements of any residential code? And then the second one is just the seismic, and without doing any calculations myself, I could probably get comfortable with the vertical capacity. But the seismic one is what I struggle with, suggesting that it would be the same. Jeremy?
Yeah, I think I'm really happy we have a lot of engineers on this group. It's a great group to have involved in this part of the discussion. My question is I'm hearing a lot of engineers address concerns with the seismic provisions of the prescriptive IRC. What about opening it to conversation of, does it need to be more of a prescriptive IRC chapter 6 for seismic A, B, and C? Exceeding that would need to be engineered. Maybe that's worth visiting about because I'm hearing a lot of seismic concerns. Thanks.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was gonna, I don't know, suggest, but throw into the mix here is the possibility of, well, for stud size, I think I heard you say, Roger, that's probably not an issue, and I think that's probably true.
I say that off the top of my.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. We've had conventional construction in the building code forever, right? And so as long as they're more or less the same with that, I'd be comfortable with that. The question on seismic, though, yeah, I could see taking A and seismic design categories A and B out. C is kind of and D definitely you want those. I think you would want those to be engineered. The question is kind of around C, I think, and in some cases it does get kicked into what we consider quote high seismic. And in other cases, it kind of gets kicked down to low seismic. And I think that's a little bit about what we need to decide here. And I'm, again, having worked in Seattle on for my career, we were always D or equivalent. So I never got into exactly what C requires. So I'm not as clear on, where this would fall.
And that's a very good point. And I have done most of my engineering in Seattle too, and we do need to allow these to be built on the east side where you don't have the same seismic requirements. So maybe that is something we need to incorporate. Michael?
Yeah, I want to, again, I'll agree with you guys that gravity loads, I'm not concerned. The analysis that I've done on gravity loads and stud walls, even without a plane wind loads, it's not an issue. Where it becomes a challenge is when we start adding in the vertical component of the seismic loading, either due to overturning at the ends of the walls, becomes more of a challenge. So I think if we're dealing with these 3-story buildings, it's the stud sizes, the gravity, I don't think we need to be concerned about. I'd also agree with John that seismic design categories A and B are probably fine just the way they are with the braced wall panels. But I do believe the work that I've done in Spokane, I don't see that significant difference in C and D, Roger, that I think grouping C and D and asking for a more robust lateral system. And again, it's just what I'm concerned about is that we provide the same level of life safety performance in these buildings as you would get in the building code construction, that we're not reducing the life safety requirements for this.
Okay. Derek.
Yeah, I agree with what they've all been saying, and I think that in my experience on the boots on the ground building this stuff, that even if it's engineered, we engineer all our stuff anyways. So maybe it's not a huge cost driver. It's something that's easily workable with the contractor. But
And being a structural engineer, if we were given a sixplex to do it now, to do the design, although now you're asking a building official to then review that design, who I'm assuming would be used to doing commercial, building code. It wouldn't be a huge number for us as an engineering firm to do a seismic only design on a 3-story multiplex building, 6-unit multiplex building. So it sounds like we're going to need to add a section, whatever that is down below. What are we, 108 maybe? Dustin, I'm not sure. And the section should say, and in effect, I'm not exactly sure that this is not language, but in effect, and if you're in seismic design category A and B, you can refer to, basically go to the residential code. If you are a 3-story in seismic design category C or D, you need to have a engineered design. Something to that effect. John?
Yeah, I don't think you need the part that talks about A and B, because that would be consistent, I think, with the code. Since we're saying the appendix is the stuff that's in addition to the code, right? So I think all you would need to say is that the reference would be to seismic design category C, and then you got the 3 Ds, right? In the residential code, you got D0, D1, and D2, or E. Then those go to, you got to then kick those over to the building code. Shall be designed in accordance with the International Building Code, and leave it at that. For seismic.
Yes.
Something, I don't have the words either, but that would be the idea.
I agree with that entirely. I just am a little bit concerned that there's ambiguity. What code requirements do we use? But I can ask again. I'm not. Number one, I haven't done a whole lot of engineering on wood frame for many years, and certainly not residential code. So let me ask some of our other partners too and see what they think.
And sorry, and maybe it's also a question for folks on the east side there, like Jeremy. Do we actually have SDC A and B on the east side? I know we've got C over there, maybe some B, but I don't know if we've got A.
Jeremy?
Yeah, to answer your question, John, I don't think we have A, and I'm in the process of reviewing Pullman's criteria because my predecessor had us in this B category, and I can't find evidence that supports that anymore on any newer maps for like the last 10 years. So it was always believed that Pullman was for some reason in a B, and I'm going to have to change our code to put us in the C. Near as I can find as I try and research the USGS maps. I don't think there is a sweet spot for B just for Pullman anymore. So I'm going to have to change that. The other question I had was for you engineers as well. And while we're looking at pointing to the IBC for seismic design categories, and this is just a question: does that kick in for all multiplex buildings? Are one level okay? Are two levels all right? Or is it just if you exceed 4 dwellings and 2 floors or 2 stories? Just wanted to throw it out there. Is there a way where people could do a 1 level 6-plex or a 2 level 4-plex and still be comfortable without having being kicked to the IBC?
And Michael, you go ahead, Michael. Michael, right? Your hand went up.
Sorry. Sorry, my microphone muted. Ardell, I was going to say the website came back up. So it's section R101.2. It says anything over 2 stories follows the IBC in Seattle.
Okay. And I was going to respond to Jeremy. Just as a structural engineer, I think that the 2 stories already are allowed for duplexes and that kind of stuff. It's when you jump up to 3 stories that I start having some discomfort. John, do you have opinions?
A little bit. Yeah, the 1 story I could see, maybe we could, you still have to get the spacing and, the wall, the brace wall lines and things like that and the spacing right. But when you get to 2 stories, it again depends on, I think, how the walls line up, right? If they do some real, oddball design and your shear walls don't line up, the brace wall panel stuff doesn't apply. So, and maybe that takes care of itself because yeah, you don't meet the requirements for, offsetting the brace wall panels and things like that. But so I'm, so maybe it takes care of itself. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I agree, definitely with Roger. When you get to 3 stories, then now, okay, let's start looking at something different.
Ardell?
Thank you for finding that for me, Mike. I was struggling because I was looking in chapter 3. I I think that this is like a really off the cuff take on this. I need more time personally to look at there's 2 criteria here, right? It's like, am I kicking it to the IBC? And then the secondly, am I requiring an engineered design? Right. So, and what is the threshold for both and for which provisions? Right. So John, you said earlier, what is the scoping limit of the prescriptive in the IRC currently? Is it 3
It goes
stories?
up to 3 stories.
That's what I thought. Okay. So it's 3 stories and it's silent on you're still allowed to use the seismic provisions in the base code.
Yeah, but it is also assuming townhouse construction or single family. Again, it's a little bit about the risk. It's a little bit about what you expect the configuration to look like.
So and then my other question is around special inspection. If we were in building code for a 6-pack, we'd be getting wind and seismic special inspection, or no, because is the presumption that this is just low loads.
I haven't thought about that one, but I would probably say, yeah, that's low loads. I'd probably go there, but don't know. I mean, there's certain things you do, depending on the design, right? Highly loaded hold downs. Okay, if they start going down the route, excuse me, that we saw in the 90s, I guess that was, these really skinny houses with high, where they started reducing the number of shear walls, and so your overturning forces got really high, and that goes a little bit to Mike Wright's point. You know, you might want to start getting special inspections on those. So it kind of depends on the design, but if they have well-distributed walls and things like that, if we go back to philosophy of some of the other previous managers that, in Seattle, it's kind of like, hey, lots of walls, good enough. So, yeah.
I think my gut recommendation on this is to limit it to 2 stories. Going back to Jeremy and the question of what, could you have a 6-pack that's 2 stories? Could I have a 3-pack that's a basement and a 2-story? And those 3-packs are in my mind going to look a lot like a single family house. So I have no heartache about allowing that in the IRC still. But I'd be fine with requiring a 3-story to be an engineered design per the IBC.
That's what I kind of lean toward, the 2-story, I'm not sure, but then I get into, it's like, what do I envision? And it's, yes, I envision all the shear walls line up vertically. And that may not always happen. And I even, if you get the ones with all one whole wall is windows, and that's not what I have in my mind, but could you get that in this in a multiplex? I think you could. So Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, my impression, and Ardell and John, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but my impression is colleagues, I have an awful lot of colleagues out there making a living just doing these 3-story mod boxes all over Seattle and the east side. And that whole kind of engineered design, if you will, of a 3-story wood frame structure, which I really don't see the 3-story multiplex being any different than that, is pretty well understood out there. And I'm concerned that if we go to just brace wall panels, in 3 stories, we are not going to get hold downs correctly designed, wall alignment, as you were saying, Roger. I'm really concerned that a 3-story building designed to the IRC does not provide the life safety performance of a 3-story building designed to the IBC for earthquakes.
Okay, John?
Yeah, the non-engineered 3-story house or whatever is a pretty rare animal anyway, certainly in my experience in Seattle. Because most of the time they don't want to put the 4-foot panels at the corners, which is required if you're going to go brace wall panels. So I think in that way, that's why I think there's so much engineering out there anyway. So maybe again, that kind of takes care of itself, because as Roger, you said, you get a lot of these houses or, apartment buildings where it's all a window wall essentially. And so you've got no shear on the exterior wall. So, you definitely want those to be engineered. But if they do manage to squeeze in, all the requirements for a brace wall panel, as Hardell said, you got a stacked 3-plex. Maybe that's okay, because that won't be that much different than a single family, if they get all that stuff in there, right? All the base panels in the right places.
Well, in general, John, my mind is going to is to tell them that be specific. If you meet these criteria and it is straightforward and all your walls stacked and whatever that criteria is, or you have to have it engineered. But
yeah,
and maybe that's too complicated, and maybe we just say it's got to be engineered. Darren.
So I was just going to mention the current 21 code table 602.10.33 for seismic bracing. D1, it's 50 lineal feet of wall line, and it does allow all the different methods. But when you go to D2, 3-story dwelling, it's not permitted for all the methods. And then if you footnote H, it says 1 and 2 family dwellings in seismic D2 exceeding 2 stories shall be designed according accepted engineering practice. So D2 doesn't allow all the methods for wood bracing for 3 stories outright in that table. D1 does, but it's very limited. So just want to throw that in there.
Wow, and not knowing enough about the residential code, maybe what's included in there is sufficient, I'm not sure. Michael?
Push the right button. My concern with allowing the IRC approach is that there are a lot of very specific requirements that most of us are kind of surprised, like things like, John, like the 4-foot segment at the end of the wall at the corners. There's an awful lot buried in the IRC that you have to do in order to qualify. And are the building officials going to be sophisticated enough on the structural side to pick up all of these specific requirements? Because it kind of seems like, you know, we're going to have maybe a novice type person submitting a design who maybe isn't aware of everything. And again, I keep coming back to the same thing. If it's not done correctly, it's not going to provide the same level of life safety performance. Or even if it's done correctly per the IRC, I'm not convinced it's going to provide the same level of performance as an IBC design, which is fairly standard for 3-story wood frame buildings. That's it.
Okay. I think, Dustin, we're gonna have to flag this as needs further work. I am a little bit driving this to a solution. I certainly can reach out to some of our partners on what we've done, and actually I was thinking some other folks that do more dealing out of the residential code than I do or we do, but and then I think we will need to actually draft the language in section 108. And somebody will need to. Derek, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just gonna put 2 more cents in there, I guess, and I think it's fine. I'm boots on the ground building stuff. Echo what they said. Engineer everything over 2 stories. It doesn't really matter. We're all engineering it anyways, and just it's a non-issue from our perspective.
We only see like a handful of prescriptive designs. Almost all are submittals, and that's why Mike it sort of took me aback because I was like, we only see engineered designs. So I don't, I don't think we've seen a prescriptive design, you know, more than a handful of times this year.
It's actually,
is that for 2 stories and 3 stories?
That's for all IRC.
Okay.
Single story even.
Yeah.
Okay. Jeremy.
I can't speak for all the east side, but I can say we get absolutely no engineering design on IRC. We're 100% prescriptive for all IRC submittals over here right now.
Good input.
Yeah.
So how would that impact you, Jeremy? Right. So if you've got a, you know, a small apartment building though, Jeremy, you're getting an engineered design now?
Well, yeah, because small apartment buildings are in the IBC, so I go straight
Right.
to all the IBC requirements. But if engineering was required and our residential contractors wanted to take care of this, try and do these, they either would not or they'd march on City Hall with pitchforks, wondering why engineering was required blanketly in the IRC.
Even though it was a 4 to 6 unit building that was 3 stories.
Exactly, and that's why I think it's important for the people that know best, the engineers on this team, to say, you know, what can be prescriptive safely, knowing what does not go into the IRC tables. I understand that, and then when this new code section kicks out, it'll just be the expectation. Hey, we can do this. If we stay 2 stories or less, we can do this prescriptively. But if we creep above 2, we're going to have to get an engineer. We know that. So just, yeah, just a little thoughtful approach to either, rather than blanketly requiring engineering for the whole multiplex portion. Is there a portion that engineers are comfortable with? If not, I get it. I'm not an engineer. But if there is a way, something is better than, nothing, right? Yeah.
Quinn,
Yeah, I brought this up a while back, but keep in mind that there's that RCW for 4 or more dwelling units. You got to have design professional. So just keep that in mind as well.
That's a new one for me, but then I'm not used to working on smaller building. And these would be, so if we four or more and 3 stories would need to have I guess just a design professional doesn't necessarily mean you have to have an engineer and seismic selection. Okay.
Yeah, to expand, it's RCW 18.08.410.
Okay. All right, Darren.
So that's that RCW, but number 5, it's including 4 dwelling units. So up to and including 4 dwelling units. So it's actually 5. Thanks.
Correct. Yeah, correct. 5 or 6. So I mean, what we're talking about is a 6-plex. So once you get to the 5, then and it's also 4,000 square foot too. So you are limited to 4,000 square foot.
Right. Thanks.
Can you give me those numbers again, Gwen?
Yeah, it's RCW 18.08.410.
Okay. Okay. Well, the structural limits need more work. What about energy code?
Exempt. Come on, that was funny.
That was very funny.
Lots of people like that. Darren, go ahead. All right. It's Eric.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'd just say have it match the residential code, IRC. I've dabbled on both sides of the IBC and IRC, and they're not too crazy. I mean, Washington's crazy as it is, but the difference is just stick it to the residential side so the residential builders aren't too completely confused.
Okay.
Dustin, maybe you can confirm. My understanding was that the energy code tag revised the 24 scoping of the residential provisions to align with the allowing the multiplex and the residential provisions.
Yeah, so we have a proposal that's going to CR 102 with that language there, where the scoping will be revised to include multiplex housing. And I believe Sherry was the one who drafted that.
Yeah. So that keeps it residential. So I don't know that you need to address it here at all.
Dustin, in the topics in the spreadsheet there, I think that put in the scoping, the proposal number.
Okay.
And I have a tendency to agree that we don't need to deal with it because either the energy code or the residential commercial energy code or residential energy code took care of that. So I actually thought that would be in the line row 40 there, but
I'm just adding it as a separate line just to leave room if we have additional discussion there.
okay. And then code correlation. I feel like we have done a pretty good job of having the discussion about where this, how much of this lives in the appendix and how much is referred back out to the various codes. Is there anything that anybody has that, this is something I think that we kind of, it's on there as a topic to make sure we do it at the end also, is to just make sure that there isn't something out there that we're missing, but is anybody aware of anything that we've done so far that we haven't been addressing? Okay. Dustin, is there, what is up above? Can we go back up to the yellow ones and start having interior stair, common use spaces, dwelling unit separation? The number that are allowed to be attached. Can we go back to some of those and start hitting on those? I think we've got 25 minutes left.
So we want to just start back up at the top and start running down that list, or
Well, sure, unless some of them, I thought that the first one, interior stairs or corridors, and that's going to be involved with the egress. So I'm going to suggest we postpone that until next meeting. Does that make sense?
makes
Yeah,
sense.
that'll give Rich and Angela and I a chance to
Yeah.
work on something.
And is common use spaces, is that also, which is the next one, is that related to egress? Because at this point, we exclude common use space.
Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
have corridors, those are considered common use. Is that or that?
Corridors are not common use.
Okay.
I don't think most building officials look at it that way, but I think common use was about the laundry rooms and things like that. And do you have a little lobby or something like that? It's not directly related to egress. I mean, they can be independent of the egress questions. It's just a question that, how do you separate them? How do you protect them? That kind of thing.
Okay. Is there, I guess I would open it up. I don't want to rehash too much, but what is there a driver? Are people wanting to make sure that there is allowed, that there are common use areas are allowed, or some common use areas are allowed?
I just need to look at this around our land use code. Because this, we have trash requirements and amenity area requirements for multifamily housing that I don't know if this would prohibit. So that in and of itself may kick us out of using these provisions if they're not allowed to have any common use areas. I totally understand why you didn't include it. It is a mess to put mixed use provisions into this code. But know that there may be consequences based on local land use requirements.
Okay, Jeremy?
I'm trying to recall when we highlighted this, and I wonder if part of it was we were wavering on how many and what type to scope based on finalizing the sprinkler discussion. I think that was a lot of it as well. Maybe this got highlighted before we knew where the tag was going to land on sprinkler requirements, if I recall correctly.
Which we landed on 13R sprinklers, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Probably after we discussed this one and just we didn't circle back if this was waffling at that point.
So now that we do have a 13R system, seems like we can open it up a little bit for some flexibility, because it should be to where I can't build a sixplex and ship it to Seattle. We have a project that was shut down because of cost constraints going up to Seattle and driven primarily by the IBC code. So we're really excited to see what comes out of this whole effort.
John?
So kind of adding into the sprinkler discussion, though, we'd have to see whether, and check with our fire folks, whether 13R, what's scoped inside in 13R, because suppose I suspect they would not allow a large storage room, right? With storage lockers and things like that to be in there. So I think it might depend a little bit on what's in 13R, and could use some help from our fire colleagues on what would be in there. There is that whole discussion going on about, and I think we talked about this earlier, Roger. It's again, it's the same issue as in single exits, right? How much exposure do you have to the building? And do you allow things like, well, you're going to have someplace you have to have bike parking. Okay, well, that includes electric bikes and electric scooters and things like that. And there's this whole issue with the lithium ion batteries that, I know our fire colleagues are really concerned about. So again, I think we still have to come up with some kind of list, as Jeremy said, of what are we going to allow in there and how big.
Hey, Marcus?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask maybe Derek, since you brought up your own kind of project that you had to cancel out, was there any common space areas that would have been in that project? Like, are there ideas, or, are you looking for bike parking? Are you looking for trash rooms, any of that type of stuff?
No, not necessarily. There's outdoor bike storage, but you walked into an entryway that was shared, and I could see a building official say, no, that's common shared use space. And then you jump on the elevator, go up to the 4th floor, and you're opened up to a vestibule that is shared to 2 other spots, but maybe that'd fall under the single exit one, not this one. So maybe I'm speaking out of turn.
Yeah, because my initial thoughts when I see this is kind of like, Ardell brought up a good point in terms of the land use codes and the amenity space areas, but also like these units will probably be large enough where like you can bring in your bike, or like Derek said, maybe it's an outdoor bike parking kind of in the backyard accessory structure type of thing. And I think these buildings also, I mean, I guess you could make the building large enough to have a shared trash room, but it also seems like you could just do 3 or 4 trash cans and roll them out to the street and not really have a lot of space dedicated within the building for that either. Just have that kind of on the side of the building, but I don't know enough there. Yeah.
Jeremy?
Yeah, if we're going to open this up to the common use discussion, I think it's fair to say that common use is defined in the IBC, but common use is not defined in the IRC. So do we need to add that definition in this appendix if we're going to have that discussion on to what to allow for common uses? Wouldn't it need to be defined? Just food for thought.
Well, that's kind of where I'm getting to. Again, my brain is going towards coming up with a list where we could add to item 2. Use of any portion of the building is limited to residential partner use only, with no common use areas except, lobby or, and maybe we need to put limits on it, but Ardell, I would be curious of what we have, what of those zoning requirements, what common use areas could we allow that would open us up to the zoning requirements that you have? And then are we comfortable listing those? So it's not you can have any.
Roger, here's another thought. What if you said, or as an exception for the local building official to take into consideration local land use codes and delicate, I don't know, give that control a little bit more local to, like, yeah.
I have a little concern with that with all of the requirements on fire and everything, but I'm not opposed to that either. John?
Sorry, I was gonna let Ardell answer the question first, but.
Yeah. So I've got the question currently out to our zoning and land use teams right now, to find out what those minimum requirements are for a 6-pack. But assuming that we need, some sort of covered trash area, and if that were to go in the building, or bike storage, or, amenity space, those are sort of the 3 that come to mind immediately for me, and they may be small. But if we were to, I appreciate the suggestion to sort of leave it up to the local building official to figure out the requirements for the mixed use building, or for a residential with an accessory use. That in the IBC would still have potentially rated construction requirements. Like, ultimately, I'd rather see that in this appendix, because we're not the only jurisdiction that has a requirement for trash on apartment buildings or amenity spaces for apartment buildings out of the zoning code.
That's where I would like us to address if there are 3 or if there are 4 common amenity area spaces. Ardell, when you say amenity space, that, you know, an amenity space is a lobby to me, but it's also a game room or a, you know, there's a lot of different definitions of amenity space, and I would want to be careful about making it too broad.
I think of amenity space as the land use and zoning requirement in this conversation, right? Because so I would treat, you know, if this had a small lobby, I would treat that as part of the R. It would still be common use, though, the way common use is defined here. And I would be okay personally with a lobby or a common stair as long as there was nothing stored in it. And then if we're going to start allowing larger spaces, and so an amenity space, I think of it as, on the zoning side, as a place where the residents are allowed to congregate for common use, and so that would be, you know, a small party room or a larger lobby. It could also mean a mailroom.
I think we need to get a list of those potential spaces out on the table. I don't know if Dustin, what's the best way to gather those potential, and then I think my hope is to just add those to item number 2 there. Is these common use spaces are allowed, and even, you know, these, if we wanted to put an area limit on amenity space maybe or something, we could do that. But John?
Oh, just thinking about if you do that, if we allow them, there's probably some limited ones that should be okay here. I think what we do need to carry over, as Ardell said, some of the separation, or decide what we're gonna do for separation requirements, for fire separations. And it would be where common areas are provided, here's what you gotta do. And depends on what those common spaces are. It could depend on what those common spaces are. For instance, again, if we're worried about batteries, you know, lithium ion batteries and things like that, maybe you need a little bit more than, you know, you would for a laundry room.
And I think, John, somewhere down below there, maybe in section 102, there's a 1 hour requirement that's called out. So it would be pretty easy for us to apply that to, you know, separations for common areas, but
sure,
if it needs to be more than that, then we would want to point that out. Rich?
I think when we talk about common use areas too, looking at the building code definition of common use, it does include the egress paths, which is also kind of talked about in item number 1 under the scope section here. And one of the concerns that we have with common use areas, even if they're storage areas and that, is they're typically unattended and they're typically no man's land, similar to the common space and probably many of our offices that are barely maintained by anybody. And so they tend to gather a lot of debris. And when things do occur, it's a long time before that's recognized. And so I would agree that if we get to the point where we were going to allow some sort of very limited common use areas, the separation and the protection is going to be key, so that if we do get a fire incident or something, that we're not, impeding the egress paths out of these buildings.
Hey, Mike.
Yep, thanks. Just circling around real quick on the fire sprinkler requirements. Just so everybody knows, as you go through and we go through common spaces, storage lockers, all that fun stuff, section 6.6 of NFPA 13R details where sprinklers are required. And in a nutshell, 13R is really only for places where folks occupy, so living spaces. Not too dissimilar to the 13D system. So as we're going down the conversation of what's going to be common use, what's not, what is allowed, we may want to promulgate code to where sprinklers are required in some of these areas because of the additional hazards that could be stored there. So going a little bit above and beyond what 13R requires.
Okay, John?
Yeah, so just to clarify, Mike, we would be extending the 13R system to cover these other areas. So it'd still be whatever the 13R design flows and things like that would be in these common spaces.
Yeah, correct. So we can still extend the system. It's cost neutral to extend those systems. But if we're going down that path, then they do need to be protected. I think Rich did a really good job of talking about some of those hazards that are going to come into play.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't going to kick them into full 13.
No, it wouldn't kick them into full 13. So the cool thing about the code is we can go above and beyond where sprinkler heads or sprinkler coverage is required, as long as it doesn't exceed the design of the system, and we still would not exceed the design of a 13R system or the intended purpose. By putting a sprinkler head, for example, in a closet, a storage closet or locker like was just described.
Okay. Well, I think that we're going to need to keep that highlighted. Particularly, it does get integrated into the egress. So I think we're going to need to make sure we address that. If we could have people email Dustin or somehow identify the potential mix accessory spaces that we think we might want, and particularly Ardell, when you get an answer from your zoning people, we certainly want to make sure these are as available as possible. So, and then the dwelling unit separation common use areas may need to be, oh, I see, you just on row 12 there, you just said if we do have common use areas, we need to address it. But the dwelling unit 102.1 says 1 hour, is that right? Can you page down there, I think? Yeah, 1 hour fires at this rating required, and then we give them options. So the reason that row 12 is flagged is just if we need to address it for common use areas, I think. Number of allowed to be attached. So Marcus, there's a comment in here that you had draft language for connecting them. Although I also seem to remember, I think I was on some email traffic back and forth, that the definition of the firewall is in the building code. So it will kind of open up a little bit of a Pandora's box if we said you could do 2 of these as long as you did a 2-hour firewall or something between them. Is Marcus still on?
Yeah, I'm still on. Yeah.
Where did you end up on that?
Yeah,
I've kind of of the opinion, maybe we just leave it at this for now and we could address that maybe in the next code cycle, but what are your?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's, I did some follow-up and asked some questions around some of the answers that people gave, like John, and we had a robust discussion the last time. I think you were probably out that meeting.
Okay.
And I think, there was a lot of general pushback of really, having two attached sixplexes and basic, or just more than 6 units being attached to each other, because from a building official perspective, that just is treated as one, one building type of thing, except unless you have the firewall. But then, like you said, the firewall is in the building code, and then we'd have to bring the firewall language into the IRC and brings complications. So, yeah, I based off of all of that, I think kind of the language that I had suggested probably doesn't need to be added, and what we have here probably works in the sense that you can do a multiplex building, 3 to 6 units. And like you said earlier, Roger, if you have more space on the lot and you do the proper separation between those, it doesn't stop you from doing multiple multiplexes on your property. It just means they can't be attached to each other and need the proper separation.
Okay. Well, then I think that we are row 15. I kind of think we can take the highlight off of that, Dustin, and let's say at this point that you can't connect them. I certainly think if folks disagree, at some point we can revisit that on at the next code cycle, if there's ways that we could deal with it. But sprinklers required.
This is another one that we discussed pretty thoroughly at the last one, and I think we were all in agreement that the sprinklers required for these buildings. The only thing that I was offering in that last discussion was if there was a general exception for a multiplex, so not more than 6 units, and if that multiplex had 2-hour fire rated walls between the units instead of the 1 hour as the normal thing. I don't really know where we generally locate. I think there's a lot of conversation about the pluses and minuses of such an approach, and that, I think there's some minuses, or some of the expense or cost drivers for building some of these things could be, kind of having to build or do the water lines to have the sufficient water pressure needed to build these buildings if you do requirements. So there might be areas where you don't want to do that, but then I think, and maybe some of the fire officials can jump in, but I think there's also just pretty good argument that the having fire sprinklers allows you to lower the standards in other portions of the code, if I'm saying that correctly. Sprinklers allow you to be a little bit less strict on some other components, type of thing, if you include sprinklers, is maybe the better way of saying that.
Darren?
I was just going to mention that I don't know if you want to go less than the R2 requirements in 420 of the IBC, which is a 1 hour fire partition. You wouldn't go less than that, but it wouldn't require a firewall. It's a fire partition or horizontal separation. That's just 1 hour around units in an R2. This is single exit, but I think that's the way to go, is 1 hour rating.
Well, we have 1 hour between units, right? That's in the section 102.1 right there.
Okay, I can't read it. It's really tiny. Sorry.
Oh. Yeah, I have it up on my big screen, so So we have a 1 hour, and I think Marcus's question is, could you, if you provided 2 hours, or a 2 hour separation between everything, could you then eliminate the sprinkler? And I know that sprinklers, well, I don't know that. What I've heard is the sprinklers is by far the best solution, but Mike, what are your thoughts?
Oh, just like everybody else, always got thoughts. A couple things, and we're really coming into some marginal thresholds. So if we look in the townhome environment, once you hit 5 townhomes in a row, you're required a 13D system. Additionally, if you look at R313, I think it's 1 that calls out those sprinkler requirements for your townhomes or 1 and 2 family. That sprinkler system takes you from the 2-hour fire rated partition barrier, whatever it may be, and drop you to an hour. So really what we're getting into what Marcus had just mentioned, first off, he's entirely correct. Sprinklers provide trade ups. I've got a couple developers in town, and I tell them flat out, even when we're doing our residential communities, if you sprinkler it, for the most part, I get to tell you, have fun building. And by the way, now you get to deal with planning and building department and everybody else, because I'll just show back up and do the sprinkler inspections. But with that, we're really into the point to where you're going from that townhome environment and creating that higher risk profile of stacking those units on top of one another. And I think we set up to what, 3 stories. So you're doing 2 by 2 straight up, whole nother risk profile. So the sprinklers are going to be needed even with that up to 6, to where once we cross over that threshold from the townhome design of the plus or greater than 4 up, sprinklers required. There's another, sorry, water supply. I was just making sure I wanted to hit all the comments because they're totally valid. Water supply, 13R is allowed to be combined with your domestic water supply. You're just upsizing to make sure you have domestic plus fire water. It's certainly nowhere close to the full 13 design, but it can be a 1 in the same design. The only additional charge is for the meter. You'll typically go from that 5/8 meter to a minimum of 1 inch meter. Maybe a little bit bigger on that, but the upcharge between your base meter and that, at least in my jurisdiction, which is one of them being Snow PUD number 1, is $250. So there's not a whole lot of upcharge on the meter. And then whatever the upsize in pipe is, but because you're not dropping that second fire line, it's again pretty much cost neutral or minimal between the two. But I just wanted to throw that out there, and I hope that answers all the questions and at least the correlation between what's in existing residential code versus what we're talking about now with the middle housing multiplex.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Derek?
Yeah, I was in agreement with the 13R, kind of going back to the whole fire sprinkler thing again. I had forgotten about the requirement of having them monitored though. And there was some discussion last time that like, oof, a lot of undue annual inspection and maintenance and monitoring and that monthly cost that you have to pay that monitoring company, dealing with false alarms, and you got 6 different owners in a condominium trying to deal with that is just a complicated situation. Did anyone have any input on that angle of it?
I think that it kind of goes into the common space, common use area. I think so. This is it's not a condominium, or at least that's not how I've envisioned it. It is a rental. That's certainly the
right
intention. And if we start adding common use areas, though, then there is an entity that has to maintain those for sure. But I don't think that just the fire sprinkler would be the only reason for that. Certainly if you have corridors, so when, again, we're getting down into the egress, if you get corridors and that kind of stuff, the residents are not going to be responsible for those. That's going to be the owner or management company. So I don't know where the sprinkler would have a huge impact. I have sprinklers in my house and I got to do the backflow preventer once a year. It's $100 or something like that I got to pay.
Yeah,
a year.
That's good. Yeah, and I think that's what they're referring to as a 13D system. We go to 13R, it has to be linked up with cell phone service and monitoring, meaning if it senses flow, the fire trucks are going to roll.
I think there's a little bit of confusion. So yeah, 13D, 1 and 2 family dwellings.
Yep.
Typically, the local notification is done by the required interconnected single station smokes that are hardwired into the units, into the houses or the dwelling units.
Yep.
When you go beyond, and we can do that in townhouses because we have the fire separation between the units, and that kind of makes them, you know, side stacked single family houses. And that works really well, separate domestic feeds and everything else. When we go to the stacked flat concept, that 13D really doesn't work well, which is I think why we're kind of sticking to 13R. In my jurisdiction, we don't allow 13R, so it's either 13D or full 13s, kind of beside the point. But as far as the monitoring goes, you're still required the in-unit smoke detection for the IBC or IRC. But there's an additional requirement that says when your fire sprinkler activates, you have to provide audibility throughout the building, including accessible notification if needed. And that's done by like mini horns typically. And that all 6 units would then be supplied by one riser system. So that if your neighbor catches their unit on fire, you know, they would have early notification by the in-unit smokes. They can deal with it. If they don't deal with it and the sprinkler activates, because you don't have all that separation between the units, when the sprinkler activates, it sets the entire building into alarm, and everybody in the building knows you caught your unit on fire, and then you can get out. The actual monitoring off-site is a local requirement. Some jurisdictions don't require or actually prohibit any kind of monitoring, and some jurisdictions do require it to be monitored, and that's typically done by a third-party alarm monitoring, ADT, Washington Alarm, what have you.
That's where my thoughts were going, Rich. That's what I was thinking. But maybe, yeah, I understood that incorrectly. In the 13R system does not require that off-site third-party monitoring, and that's only the full 13 requires that monitoring.
Depends on the local jurisdiction. Typically.
Copy.
Okay. Micah.
Thanks. I'm going to jump in here and just throw out the new proposal that did get approved for this upcoming code cycle. And it's also aligning with some of the new proposals for the 2027 code, which is allowing 13D systems to go to 4 stories and 60 feet, similar to the 13R for R occupancies, especially 1 and 2 family and townhouses. And I'm just curious if this is going to, that new proposal, cause any issues with these units being required to put in a 13R, where the possibility is if, and the indication at the national level is if you built this out of the building code right now or upcoming, that you could use a 13D. So just throwing that out there for discussion. I know it's all seems to be revolving around the 13R system and not even considering 13D, but my understanding from the national level is they're trying to push and use the 13D system more often in structures like this. So just something to consider. And I'm sorry, I don't have the proposal number right off the top of my head for the current cycle. Actually, I take that back. I think it's G96. But I want to say that is upcoming in the 2027. And we have something similar in the 2024 from the fire folks. Thanks.
Micah, just to clarify, that is for townhouses up to that height, not for apartment buildings.
It is, yes, and that's what I'm asking. Is that going to cause any issues, and are we causing this to be much more restrictive than you would a 4-unit or a 4-unit townhouse building?
Right. So I think just from my point of view, that yes, Mike and I work at the same place. That is a different hazard, because that proposal is around a ground to sky hazard of side-by-side units versus the stacked that's in this proposal.
I think so. Ardell and I will have to go back and verify Jeff Shapiro's original proposal, but I wasn't sure it only revolved around townhouses. I think it was for all our occupancies is what they had desire for. But again, I got to go back and reread the original proposal. I do believe ours, that the state, yes, is specific to townhouses.
I did have one other comment on the common use, if it's okay. Do I share that now, Roger? So I got feedback from our zoning folks on the in Seattle, and the 6-pack in the middle housing interim regulations, while it does have requirements for solid waste and so trash standards and amenities, there's no requirement for those to be located indoors. Same thing for the bike parking. There is a requirement for bike parking for a 6-pack, but it would not have to be inside the building. So I think that as we look at common use areas, while it's solvable, it allows more flexibility to allow some of these more typical common use areas with separation. I would be supportive of putting those in the code, because that's going to be sort of the first ask, like, okay, you got this, but where do I put my services? You know, the way this is written, it's like we'd kicking them back out to the building code if they don't keep those things outside of the building as currently drafted. And then the second part is, if we are going to put multiple, you know, you've talked about the scenario of, especially around EV, of having multiple multiplex buildings on the same site. That may have different zoning and land use requirements. That wouldn't be allowed in our NR zones, but would be allowed in an LR zone. So I think that when you start seeing those other occupancies, those buildings that carry the other occupancies would then need to be an IBC building if it doesn't meet whatever constraints we put around it. So I think that middle housing is solving for one thing, but when you start putting this multiplex as a typology, that you'll see that going beyond just the zones that are envisioned for middle housing. That's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm back. I don't know if you missed me or not. Derek?
I noticed you were gone. We're running up against our meeting time. If we want a motion to extend a couple minutes to allow these last comments,
Could I have a motion to extend for 10 minutes so that we can finalize this?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
I didn't hear who that was.
Second. Derek.
Derek, thanks. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we've got 10 minutes to, hopefully we can wrap this up. Derek, go ahead.
I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but, or in the previous session where we were talking about this, but is it possible to waive the 13R system and go to a 13D system if it's set up similar to townhomes where they're jammed side to side and not on top of one another? I'm just thinking of some of the little bit lower density areas and a single family lot where it doesn't necessarily land use code permit townhomes outright, but it allows for by state statute, it allows for infill or middle housing. And you're stuck between this spot. Well, yeah. Is that, am my thoughts making sense?
Your argument makes sense. Potentially, I think. We can have other folks respond. Darren?
I guess hearing that 13D is going to 4 stories because the IRC only goes to 3 stories for townhomes. So that puts the 13D into the IBC now, I'm thinking, because this would help a project we had that was 4-story townhomes that they had to follow the IBC as R2. So I guess these are R2 as well. So it's kind of like a moving 13D into the IBC. That's kind of my question. So thanks.
Okay, I just want to jump in. I was going to respond to Micah before my computer froze on me. This proposal will go into the 2024 code. So if they are making changes to allow 13D or expand the use of 13D in the 2027 code, I want us to align with the current 2024 code. If that needs to be adjusted in the next code cycle as we're considering the 2027 code, so be it. And we can make those changes at this, at a later time. So
We have the approval in now. It already went through the building code tag. It is a current proposal for the 2024.
Oh, for the 2024. Okay, all right. Thank you. Then disregard what I said. Spencer?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it sounds like there's still some question about exactly how the 13D, 13R distinction would be applied under this new proposal. But to me, that seems like a really important aspect for us to learn a little bit more about before we make a decision. So I would support getting more information if we can.
Okay, I am too. I'm not sure we're gonna resolve it today, but let's get everybody's comments and then we can bring it back up. John?
I got two things. One, just responding to Derek's kind of question is that townhouses are still allowed under the IRC. And so this, they don't have to get thrown under the umbrella of the multiplex housing. So townhouses still exist, so you can still build a townhouse per IRC townhouse regulations.
Sure, I'm tracking with you, John. I'm just saying that if you've got a single family zoned residential area that don't allow townhomes in a particular jurisdiction, for example, but they do allow the infill housing, maybe it's a code conflict. It'd just be nice to be able to do quote unquote townhomes under the multiplex. That was just my thought.
I think the problem that would start confusing things. Is it a townhome? Is it a townhouse? Is it a multiplex?
Yeah,
I do. It'd be better to just keep them separate.
Yeah, I do detached multifamily. I call my stuff all kinds of stuff. I get an approved box by the state and it gets permitted as a single family home, as a hardship, as a guest house, as a multiplex. Yeah.
ADU.
So,
yeah, right.
yeah.
The other thing I wanted to just throw something on, we don't need to discuss right now, but I want to throw something onto the list for future discussion, Dustin. We talked about, we've kind of leaning on the side of saying you can't attach them. But there is a little bit of ambiguity about how much separation is required between them. Can I put them 1 inch from each other? And if so, what's required for the fire separations and things like that? So I think we just need to look at that and make sure we've got the right regulations for that.
Okay. Thank you, John. Mike?
Yeah, a couple things. So first off, when we talk about codes, the reference code that you're going to see for the 2024 IRC in this case would go back to NFPA 13R 2022 edition. Would be what we would reference. The 25 edition is currently out, and the next edition would be 28. I'm not seeing those height limitations or the extensions on 28 yet. So if I'm not seeing them in the public comments on 28, my only assumption would be that'll be like a 2031 change, but I'll see if I can't dig into that a little bit more. And then I think the other part of Derek's question is that if you did the multiplex housing single story as like a townhome design, then 13D would be completely appropriate in that case. What shifts us into the 13R is when you stack it on or stack your units on top of each other. That now becomes a multifamily house, regardless of what we do in this. So we have to apply that multifamily code being the 13R system. So I hope that helps a little bit. And then I've also got a fact sheet from NFPA that if it's all right, I'll send over to Dustin that describes the 3 systems and gives you a quick rundown.
I just wanted to have some sort of exemption written into the code here that says, hey, if you are a single occupant from ground floor all the way to the top, then and separated by a 1-hour firewall or something, you can go to a 13D system. That's all.
Yeah, and just so you know, that's current code. That's already in the IRC if you go to R313.1.
Perfect.
Yeah, so there, we don't even need to do anything. If you're following R13.1, if you're following or going the townhome route, it does move you down to a 1 hour fire barrier and then a 13D system. So we don't have to make any changes or exemptions.
I could see a local building official or fire marshal say, nope, you're using this exemption under this appendix. You got to follow everything under the appendix. I've had some weird stuff happen. Yeah, with Appendix Q with small structures in specific under the IRC Appendix Q.
Okay. Well, if you had a problem with the fire marshal, send them my way and I'll tune them up on that one. I can't do anything for you on the building official side. But I see where you're going. So one of the things I could see the argument from code enforcement is cherry picking requirements.
Right.
And that's something that we have throughout to where my jurisdiction does allow you to use later editions or more current editions of standards, but you're not allowed to cherry pick. It's pick one and you do it all the way through.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, no worries, buddy.
So Mike, I think that would be great if you can send that document around. We talk about it and I don't know the differences. So that document would be great education for everybody. And Micah, if you can make sure that we get the proposal number so we can all look that up and make sure that we have that available too. I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and leave that as yellow, although Justin, if you can go back up, I actually think Marcus's comment about, no sprinklers and going to 2 hour, I don't know that that's necessarily on the table anymore. So I think we are all assuming that sprinklers are required. So you could probably take that one off of the yellow highlight, but on the sprinkler type, that's the one that should be yellow and we're the one below it. And we're thinking that that needs some further discussion. And you might want to put in there 13R or 13D, and maybe even eventually put in the proposal number that's in the.
It'd be like a 13D exemption or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So we know that we need to look at that and it's exceptions. So we know we need to revisit that. But okay.
I got the proposal number. I don't have it right this second, but I'll pull it.
Okay.
I'll pull that one. And then Mike, if you send me that breakdown of the 3 different types of systems, I can disseminate out to the group.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We are, we've got a lot of egress stuff and we have some sprinklers and a few other miscellaneous, but I think we've made good progress and we're getting there. So I appreciate everybody's time. I will close the meeting and we will see you in 2 weeks to talk about single exits.
Yes. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good day.